so it might make you
okay.
consent.
Continue. Okay.
So we've typically had between 20 and 40-ish on the Zoom, and then is between 200 to 1,000 that will watch either live or later on
That's
Facebook.
Great.
As people share it with other folks. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah. I don't really know how to figure that out, if it's topic based or when people are busy or on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
It's beyond me. I'm just grateful that people are watching. So
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. All right. Welcome, everyone. I said I would start us promptly at 2 p.m. and here we are. I am Pastor Megan Rohrer, they, them, but comfortable with whatever pronouns end up happening during conversations. You are at our town hall, where we're listening to voices that help us think about ways we can minimize bias. We began these conversations every Friday since shelter in place began, so we're in about month 5. We started by listening to the voices of folk who could help name some of the biases that exist in the Lutheran Church. We listened to people who were from racially diverse communities. We listened to folk who had a spectrum of types of bodies and bodily needs. We listened to people with a spectrum of genders. We've listened to people with a spectrum of sexual orientations. And now we are in our 3rd town hall that is collecting best practices that congregations or individuals might use in hopes of minimizing some of these biases. For those of you who are joining us on the Zoom webinar, you will notice that you do not have access to video or voice in this conversation. That is a twofold purpose for that. One is we want to really focus on the people that we are listening to. And we also want to decrease any opportunities for people who might want to intentionally disrupt these conversations. For those who are listening on Facebook, you are welcome to lift up any questions. I'll be monitoring the comments. You can use hashtag #LutheransListen. And if you forget about the hashtag, I'll still probably find your comment. If you're in the Zoom space, you can use the chat function to just share information that you have or talk to other people who are here listening to the panel. And if you would use the Q&A section to lift up questions, that'll make it easier for us to notice them. Having done those logistics, I want to just name that while the Holy Spirit mightily shows up when we are interacting in an online space, that being recorded and having your comments frozen in time and archived somewhere is a bit of a leap of faith. And so as we have our conversation today, we want to be open to the fact that sometimes technology fails us. Sometimes we misstate things that we would definitely be better at stating in the future. And that we have the ability to speak for our own individual experience, but not have to represent an entire community of people in our conversation. And with that, I would like to invite our guests today to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Bohn. My pronouns are she and her. And I, in my work life, am the director of the Mayor's Office on Disability in San Francisco. What our office does is help oversee compliance for people with disabilities in the city, but it also serves to try to bring the issues of people with disabilities to the greater attention of our community in the city and across the Bay Area. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm glad to have the space for this conversation today.
Would you also identify as a Lutheran?
I would.
Yay!
I am also in my personal kind of upbringing. I am originally from the upper Midwest, where most people are kind of Lutheran by default. And so I have been a part of faith community in primarily Lutheran congregations for the majority of my life. So I also am coming to this conversation with my professional experience, but also with my experience many years being a parishioner in different congregations. So hopefully that can add some spice to our conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to speak a little bit about some of the ways that your personal faith maybe is influenced by your intersections that you embody in this world.
Sure. So I've been I've been thinking a little bit about this question, and I would say that it's my journey in this area has been um, complicated and not one that I have been able to work through easily when I start to think about identity, right? So for myself, if I identify first as a woman, and if you can't tell, I have my background on, but I am a person with a disability. I use a mobility scooter, and I've had a lifelong disability, so I also identify as a person with a disability. And so when I think about how I identify, when I'm thinking about my faith, the first things that kind of come to mind are the struggles that I've had, just not specifically with the Lutheran Church, but just in thinking about the stories that we tell in church and in the Judeo-Christian dogma, and how much when we talk about disability in those stories, how complicated that is for me to think through as a person with a disability, where if you don't identify as a person with a disability, you might not think that much about it. So for instance, there's a lot of parable that talks about making the blind see, or making the deaf hear, or making the lame walk, or what have you. You get where I'm going. And so in that assumption, it's very layered, right? So first of all, it assumes that whether you take those kind of stories as literal or metaphorical, it still assumes that if you have a disability and identify that way, that is something that is either bad or something that needs to be changed in order to get to a different place. And so hearing those stories as a person with a disability, I think inherently you start to think about, oh gosh, so my existence is something that shouldn't be the way it is. If you're looking at it through the lens of those kind of stories or those kind of parables. And so that's what I mean when I say that the journey and the way that I think about kind of my first and earliest memories of what that means in the church has been really complicated. And I'm not sure that I'm all the way through how I even feel about that, but I think that's been my personal experience, and I think that kind of that struggle of kind of good versus bad, or healing and curing and all of that kind of stuff that we talk about can get really complicated for a lot of people with disabilities.
Yeah, thank you. My personal experience as someone with a hidden disability that isn't as physically obvious, I'm on the autistic spectrum, and so I have found that sometimes in faith communities, when I try to identify myself, that people want to give me a compliment by saying, "You're not disabled.
Right.
You're wonderful in all of these ways," which I appreciate because it's lovely to be affirmed, but can be really hard to be erased sometimes, or to not want to identify with this idea that it would be better to not be disabled because that's not
Mm-hmm.
my personal experience. And so I'm so appreciative that we can kind of talk about some of these issues in faithful spaces out loud
Mm-hmm.
in a outside of a church building where our conversation is about experiences we've had, but it's not about shaming or blaming anyone who's hearing the conversation, if that makes sense.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I think, in my experience, a lot of people just haven't had opportunity or space to just reflect on that piece of it because it hasn't been their experience. And so that's why conversations like these are so important.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know there's some studies that say it's 20% of congregations. Some studies say it's 40% of congregations, of individuals in congregations who have some sort of disability, whether or not it's known on the outside of their body or not.
Mm-hmm.
And my sense is that as congregations age and people's mobility might decrease with their age, that it is something that, if we live long enough, we might experience some ways that our mobility decreases or our vision decreases, or some of the things that we thought um, made us kind of outside of the realm of disability might shift at some point in our life after a tragedy, or right. And so um, I just wanted to name that sometimes our position thinking about disability can change really rapidly based on our what our own bodies are up to, what the people we care about, what their bodies are up to, and kind of the unexpected ways that those change in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts? As we've been talking about best practices, we've been kind of trying to think about them in three separate kind of windows. One is how individuals can do work that's needed, how congregations can do work that's needed, and then how like systems, like larger church-wide organizations, can do work that they need to be doing. Um, Starting at that kind of first level, do you have any thoughts about what would a best practice look like if someone wanted to decrease biases that they might have,
Mm-hmm.
or even learn what the biases are
Right.
that people with disabilities experience? What are some ideas that you have about how individuals could work on that?
Mm-hmm. I think a couple of things that I think as in this space that we're in now, as we think about how we're reflecting on racism and sexism and all of the other isms that we need to be thoughtful about, ableism needs to be added to that conversation. And in my experience, most people, the first reaction when I say that is, oh, ableism, that's a thing. Like what is that, right? And so it's as the other isn't. There's a lot of technical definitions that you can look up, but the way that I think about it practically is when we are unintentionally or implicitly viewing the world from an able-bodied, able-minded perspective that might be unintentionally, or in some cases, unfortunately, intentionally, but in most cases, implicitly excluding people with disabilities. So I think the first thing that I recommend is that just kind of as an individual, one way to start thinking about this is just thinking about all of the language that you use in a given day that might, um, you know, be perceived as ableist language. So, one example that I use all the time that's a hard one to um, to get out of our vernacular is people will say, "Oh, that's so crazy," right? And so if you think, and then, but if you talk to people with mental health disabilities, they're going to have a response to that word, right? And so that's one way. Or one phrase that's come up a lot, I do a lot in my job around emergency management and response right now. And right now we are standing up a bunch of programs. That's a very common phrase. I'm going to stand up this food services program. You know, and so, and I have a reaction to that word. I'm not offended, but I do pause and think, how can we, I wonder if we can say something else instead, right? And so just, I guess, just first reflecting and noticing as you're thinking through the world, how, how the way that we use language impacts the way that someone might feel about that. And in the same way that we are really intentional and reflective in the other language that we try to use in our daily lives and in the church too, hopefully in most cases.
Yeah, or I would think too, like, even if for like 1 month people paid attention to when a hymn had language that was something someone might not physically be able to do, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we are rolling in the light of God,
Mm-hmm.
right? and
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't mean you have to fix everything right away. It just means you start to notice and pay attention to it, is what I'm hearing you say.
Right. Yeah. Because, I mean, because I think the disability community, and I mean, I'll speak for myself first, and just the that language, you just hear it over and over and over and over and over, and depending on where you are in your identity as a disabled person, there are some people that, I mean, disability identity in itself is something that evolves and is different for every single person. There are people who would qualify under, you know, legal definitions or social definitions as disabled people who do not identify that way, and that's fine. And then, you know, on the other end of the spectrum are people who I call capital D disabled, who identify politically as a part of their identity as a disabled person, and that gives people a sense of political power. So everybody is in a different place in that identity spectrum. So knowing that, then when you start to notice all of the different places where we've taken and used phrase and language, it starts to kind of get into your system and get into your blood. And some people are able to absorb it and move through it. And some people say, that's enough, no more church for me, just because of that, right? And so that's I think, a good place to start.
Yeah, and I would say too, like, even just like familiarizing with some of the language could be helpful, because we live in an age where if you are someone for whom technology works for you, or seeking out videos, I'm assuming that because people are watching this video that they have some way to connect to video, right? And so we do live in an age where you can seek out conversations like this. So you can go on to a YouTube like space or a podcast space or whatever the space is that provides you with entertainment, and can like look up conversations where you can kind of learn more. Even during that time when you haven't perfected how to speak the words correctly, you can listen to the words, if that's within your modality. And so like learning about words, like for some people, when you talked about people who are very, I would say it's kind of like the LGBTQ spectrum. Like there's some people who identify as lesbian or gay, and there's other people who identify as queer, right? So there's some people who use disability language. There's other people who use CRIP language, who've reclaimed some words that have felt meaningful to them. There's language like autism, like a type of discrimination that people who have hearing impairments talk about. And so even just like looking up through a reputable website what some of the language around disability is, can be a really helpful place for people to start, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of before I came into this world in city government, I worked in 20 years in higher education, and there's been a lot of work done in higher education on the issue of language and disability too. So if folks are interested, there are a lot of resources out there. And we have also a national network of resource banks called the ADA National Network. They've done some work on this. So there's a lot of places that people can go and educate for sure.
So thinking about congregations, what are some ideas that you have for congregational spaces about how they can decrease biases that might be, physical biases or emotional biases and things like that?
Yeah, this, I think, first of all, again, now I talked about kind of the individual kind of way to notice, but as we're talking as congregations, can we add talking about disability and ableism to part of what we talk about as a group, right? So then it moves away from the individual and into a more collective space. So I mean, that's the first thing. And then I would say, as you're having those conversations, to start thinking about the way that you're holding services, if you're holding services in a physical space, or virtually, and then what does that mean in terms of having as much kind of access as you can, but then also thinking about your practices and why you're doing them that way in the service in the first place. Are you doing them that way because that's just the way you've always done them? In my experience, that's usually the answer. So, like, for instance, if we think about the physical church space, which I know many of us have not been in quite a while, but very commonly, this is a very simple example, people will say, please stand. Why? I mean, I understand why in terms of the reverence or whatever, however else you want to think about it, but really, do we really need to make everybody stand up? I don't know. Maybe not. So, and so just some things like that. And I think and then I think we do have a unique opportunity right now. There aren't that many things that have been positive in terms of COVID, right? It's mostly been a negative time, and especially for people with disabilities, extremely bringing to extreme struggles that have really been brought to light. But one of the more positive things is that for folks who have access to a reliable internet connection and a computer, people with disabilities in particular have been able to participate now in ways and in meetings and in conversations in ways that I have never seen before. We, in July, celebrated the 30th anniversary of the ADA, and there were some fantastic virtual gatherings. I was on one that had up to 300 people from around the world on it. That was amazing, right? And I don't think we would have thought about it in that way before we were all forced to figure out how to listen to each other and learn from each other and experience each other in a virtual way, right? And so what I mean when I say we have a unique opportunity is that when this is all over, or when we're in the next phase, maybe let's say, where we are meeting in person maybe, and then meeting, and then we know how to do things virtually now, is I guess what I'm trying to say. So do we need to stop that because COVID is over? Think about that and what that means in terms of the possibilities of people who, because of whatever reason, health concerns, disabilities, whatever reason, can now participate and maybe experience the community in a new way. Because I mean, at least for me, what the most important part about being part of a faith community is the community part. And so, and I think that we have an opportunity now to keep the good things that we've figured out how to do going, and now reframe some of the ways that we used to do things to be a little bit more inclusive.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that COVID might gift some of our congregations is as we have to figure out social distancing. Some of our congregations that maybe had spacing. I know I'll just speak for our congregation so no one feels like I'm talking about them in a metaphorical way. So our congregation, the pews were so close together, I had to turn sideways to walk through them. So they were designed for smaller bodies who were very agile. And even if I turned sideways, I knocked over everything that was in the little pew holders as I walked through. And it felt like they were too close together, even for someone who could do kind of acrobatics to kind of get down the space. Social distancing means that you have to, at some point, if you're coming back together, figure out how to worship just slightly farther apart, right? And for some people who need a little bit more room for auditory reasons or sensory reasons, or to park their scooter, or whatever the reason is that folk might need that space, I think congregations are having to brainstorm some of that right now in ways that maybe will be kind of lovely. At least that's my prayer, right?
I hope so too. I really do.
Would you be willing to talk about the way that opting out of the ADA building improvements maybe has contributed to our congregations having some biases in them?
Of course. I get this question a lot. And I wish, first of all, I'm just going to say flat out, I wish it was an easier question to answer because it's definitely had impact. So for those of you who may not know, so churches and places of worship and faith community gathering spaces are exempt from federal ADA requirements, meaning federally, you're not required to make that space accessible at least by the federal code. And so what that means is there's also, because there's not a requirement, there's not a lot of incentive, right? But now in California, that federal law still exists, but in California, if you have architectural barriers, no matter what kind of space you are, you're still required to remove the architectural barriers, right? And so there are things that you can do to start thinking about that. But I do think that just the nature and shape of a church space, not having to think about it rather than out of goodwill or what have you, at least with the physical requirements, really has changed or it really does impact the way that people with mobility and some physical disabilities anyway will experience or want to experience a church. So it's definitely, that piece is definitely problematic. Now, there are things that you can do to still qualify for grant funding, like become a 501c3, and then you get tax credits, and there's stuff. There's ways that you could be creative around it, but you need to collectively want to do it as a congregation. The other thing that I'll say, though, is the flip side of that we also need to think about is I've also talked to communities where they'll say, oh, we have a ramp and an elevator, so we're good. Done, hooray, not enough, right? So it's also about thinking beyond that, getting into the building space. What does your internal space look like, right? So that's one thing. What kind of circulation and what kind of access do you have? But then also, have you thought about access for folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, or access for other folks with other sensory disabilities, and what that really means, access for people who are blind or low vision, right? There's much more to think about than just the ramp into your church. And I'm not trying to minimize it or kind of place an assumption that is all churches think about, because I don't think that that's true in every case, but I have heard that, right? And so this whole thing of like, oh, okay, well, we've got a ramp, and people are very proud of that, and they should be, because that's a great step. But I'm just encouraging
It's not a
folks
step.
to think
It's a ramp.
that's right. I just used ableist language. It's a ramp. So we need to continue and just keep going is what I'm saying.
So my congregation that I serve at is a small congregation. They don't have much funding. When we first started talking about ADA and building issues, we got the comment that every congregation has. I bet you could even say it with me. We can't afford it, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what we did instead is our council passed an agreement that we cared about ADA improvements, and that anytime something broke, instead of fixing it, we would replace it with the ADA upgrade.
Mm-hmm.
And what that meant was, if a toilet got clogged and it was going to cost $70 for the plumber to unclog the toilet and $300 to get the toilet that was the proper height with the handle on the correct side, and
Mm-hmm.
and put up the hand railings, that instead of unclogging the toilet, we would replace the toilet with an ADA upgrade. In the last 6 years, I would say we've gotten our congregation so much farther than anyone ever imagined that we could in ADA upgrades, just
That's
by
awesome.
making that simple principle. And part of that too is that we identified spaces where an ADA upgrade wasn't just for disabled people, right? It would have been enough to fix it just for people with disabilities. But when we were able to see that a gender neutral bathroom helped both someone who needed their aid in the bathroom and a trans person and people who
Yes.
emotionally don't like going to the bathroom at church spiritually with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Once we found that there was more than one constituency group, it was a lot easier to make repairs. Because it wasn't about this imagined person who maybe would come to our church someday.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think, I think that's a really good point. I'd like to add to that. It's like, that's what we think about when we think about universal design. The principle of that is, how are we designing it so that as many people can use the space as possible? Like one of the this kind of leads into one of the things that I was thinking about before we started talking is there anything that I wish that we would have to stop talking about, an approach that we could just stop using, right? So one of those approaches is to, if I'm thinking through kind of my own, and I've been part of multiple congregations, and it's been something that's happened every time, not placing blame on any of my congregations, it just happens. The question that congregations tend to ask is, what does Nicole want? Or what does Nicole need? And I've
been in one of those meetings before.
Really don't like that question. Yeah. And all of my faith communities know I don't they know I don't like that question too. It's not like I haven't been quiet about that. It's not the point. So what would I wish we would stop? I would like us to stop thinking past. I would like us to think past the individual congregant and into, what does this mean in a broader way? Because we want to invite as many people as possible into our virtual or physical spaces. But also, I think one of the things that happens is, so often people with disabilities are inadvertently or because of our implicit biases or whatever it is, we're placed in a position as disabled people as teachers and teachers of others. And so it becomes, oh, I'm not sure what we should do. Let's ask the disabled person. Now, should you ask disabled people? Yes. I'm not trying to say don't do that. But and people with disabilities need to be around the table in all of our spaces all the time. Absolutely. But if you're looking at it toward your individual congregate, it's also putting unfair burden maybe on that person to solve for a community. Or if you're someone who is struggling with your disability identity to begin with, you might just say, oh, forget it. like don't do it because of me. I don't want to cause any trouble, right? Because they don't want to feel like they're a burden to other people, which is also one of those a really common trope in disability culture, is this idea of kind of dealing with what does it mean to be burdensome, something I think about, nearly every day, and especially during COVID, where I and a lot of people with disabilities need additional supports right now that we as disabled people didn't need before. And so anyway, it's all the more important to just kind of just think about it more broadly and just do it. I mean, so for instance, a good practice that still costs money, but maybe not as much, is if you have someone who is deaf or hard of hearing in your congregation and you're thinking maybe, having captions on your Zoom chart would be better for everyone, then just hire someone to do that. Or, think through your congregation. Maybe you can set aside part of your budget or your annual giving towards just that, right? So you just have it and do it, and then it's just there, and then the person who might benefit from that doesn't have to ask for it. It's just there. That's a model of universal design that works for everyone, just as one example.
Yeah, we've made a couple of decisions in our congregation, like resisting filming with multiple non-family groups, because the folk in our congregation who are hard of hearing need to be able to see lips. And so sometimes that means we make a different choice than the one that might have been our first choice, but because it means more people will be able to experience that worship service. A couple of cool building things we've been able to do in our congregation is just one that's really surprising, because I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. We were trying to get closer to meeting all of the fire code requirements at the same time.
Of course.
And the insurance company had this list of go check for all these things. And so it made it really easy, which is why I want to have a similar list for bias, go check these things in your building that you might not have even known, right? One of the things that we changed was all the doorknobs. We changed them from circle knobs to the flip knob, some of which were fixed so that they could just be pulled without, all of them could be pulled without grasping.
Right.
Every single door in the entire congregation, right? Some had code locks or fobs for people who couldn't, push the code system. If they were outside doors, we changed all the doorknobs. We thought we were just doing it for fire code. And I can't even tell you the number of people I had no idea had pain in their hands, who, after they came to the church the next time, they said, thank you so much for changing those. I didn't even know it hurt me every time I came to the church until you changed it. And so, it was so inexpensive to decrease someone's pain. And if we would have known, we would have done it so much sooner.
And in California, those kind of handles are in our California code as well. So they help in a fire emergency, they help, and then they also help people, with arthritis or whatever kind of disabilities they have. So that's a really a great second example. Yeah.
Yeah, and after this conversation at justlutheran.com, where we put the archived videos, I'm going to post the handout because I think I read a handout from your office that actually described what access was, even if you're not required by church or by the church stuff, like what the minimal access level was. And that might have been where we connected the dots on the handles being a helpful thing for
Great.
for everyone. Yeah. So thank you for that document. The other thing that was really transformative for our congregation was we had a lot of shame, right? Because being ADA accessible was all about the ramp for a really long time. And we had this set of stairs that it just felt shameful. Like, look, we have this set of stairs, right? And they had figured out how to have a ramp into the lowest level space, but we're kind of on a hill. And the sanctuary is on the second floor, and we had a chairlift, which was about the best they were able to do at the time they had done it. And they had gone through this whole process to try to put in an elevator, but it just hadn't worked to vote for it. We've found some solutions through companies that help, like construction spaces, where they'll help you build temporary aluminum outdoor stuff that you can do temporarily. That I think we're about halfway to raising the funds we would need to get up to the second floor.
Great.
But in the meantime, we decided we would do something to feel less shame about our stairs, right? We learned about how people with vision impairments have a hard time walking upstairs and why. And the I think it was that same document was talking about all stairs having these visually identifying marks at the end of each level. And we started researching outdoor stairs. And San Francisco has this great tradition of tiled, beautiful outdoor stairs, right? And so we made a tile mosaic about Isaiah 55 on the side of the stairs, and then on the top we made them white.
Oh, great.
With the yellow tread, so that people can see as they're going up the space. And we made the handrails, better ADA. And so we weren't able to do 100% of what our goal was, but we found a way to have less shame and to think about a different community that had needs around those stairs. And we did have seniors who were afraid of going up those stairs because they couldn't see where one step ended. And so I wanted to lift that up as just an example of, if you're stuck at one problem, maybe think about a different community,
right?
A different need, right? Because there's 7 senses. And in each of those 7 senses, there are people who have some sort of differing way that they embody that. And so sometimes I think go ahead.
Yeah. I think that that's a good way to think about it. I mean, there are lots of code requirements. And I think one thing you'll find too is that even in the best case, when you followed everything, you have the world's best access certified specialist who's done everything to the letter. I mean, it's still a code that is imperfect, right? And so you can get really close to solutions that work for most people, but even in the community, we still argue about code requirements all the time. Add this to the code, take this out of the code. We need this, we don't. So all of that to say is that definitely do the best you can, and do engage to think through what is going to work. For if you might need to come up with another solution that an architect didn't think about, that will work for other members of your congregation. So it's about being intentional in thinking through all of your barriers, the physical barriers, the sensory barriers, the language barriers, all of that, and starting to chip away.
Yeah, and I mistakenly said that there were 7 senses, and I think there's only 5 senses, right? Sight,
there
sound,
might be 7,
touch.
I don't know.
Yeah, maybe some metaphysical ones. Yeah.
Right.
Right, but there's some people for whom touching something is difficult. There are some people for whom eating food and digesting things is difficult. There are people who have impairments around their vision or impairments around hearing. And so that's what I was referencing with those senses. Are there Do you know of any congregations who have kind of successfully transformed attitudes around being communally aware of at least conversations about disabilities? It's okay if you don't, because your work is primarily in the public sphere. So
It is primarily in the public sphere. I am not sure, I think is the best
is there
answer to that one.
is there like a building in San Francisco that if congregations nearby wanted to visit, you'd say this building's doing some interesting things?
No, but what I would say, but I think what I would say though is I do know when I think through all of everybody who's working through the Interfaith Council, for instance, these are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having in those kind of settings because, and we need to be sharing our solutions with each other, right? And intentionally doing so, so that we're creating spaces that work for most people kind of across the board. And the reason I say that is that that's the way that we have solved in disability community all the time, you know, and that's the way that we're solving right now in COVID. We are getting together more. I'm meeting with my professional counterparts more in different cities, and we're saying we have this problem now that's brand new to everybody. Let's think through how we're going to do this so we're not all doing it in 10 different ways, right? And so that's more what I mean, is start sharing your success stories, because if I don't know them off the top of my mind, definitely other people with disabilities aren't going to know them and not going to feel invited, whether they would want to be part of a faith community or not. So we need to be talking about it more, I think.
I love that. Let's think about institutions now. And do you have anything that you think would be helpful for like church-wide organizations to think about?
Well, I think firstly, since we've spent so much time thinking about architecture and understanding that California allows some barrier removal that's beyond what is the requirement federally. I think federally, nationally, the church could think about, can we do something as the larger church to incentivize our congregations to start doing some of this stuff, even though it's not a federal requirement, right? So we really need leadership there. And I mean, and again, I don't want to make it sound like nobody's done anything, because I know people have, but really taking the opportunity of us being 30 years now into the ADA, really looking at our spaces and our congregations and looking at who's there and who's not, and who's proud to speak up and who maybe isn't, and just really starting to think about strategically, how can we start to teach and our faith leaders to just have more awareness and an intentional kind of action plan around some of this stuff. Not just the physical barrier removal, but in thinking through what we were talking about earlier around the way that we use language in the space, the way that we're now virtually, presenting a lot of our services, the way that our physical or kind of in-person practices maybe unintentionally ableist, right? Really starting to think about what is a way that the church can kind of put together toolkit and strategies so that our churches aren't like feeling like they're doing all of this, one-to-one reconnaissance and reinventing the wheel every time, right? That's not efficient for anybody. And so, if we have national leadership around it, that's great, I think.
Yeah, that's kind of where where I've kind of been thinking, and part of what inspired to do these town halls is I kept wishing like a synod or the churchwide would do it, and I was like, I'm just going to do it then because we're the church and here we go, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I just really want to recommend and lift up what you said, that like the more people are able to share, like brag about yourself a little bit so that other people can try to copy the thing that you did, right? And
Right.
so because it just gives people new ideas of things that they can try. And I think I wish there was like a Facebook warehouse where like all the great ideas about how to make your faithful space, like, do you know what I mean? Like I can just
Mm-hmm.
imagine it being like, here's a picture of a church in Wisconsin and they solved the issue of communion cups being hard to hold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like whatever the ideas are that different communities have settled on. I wish there was kind of an idea
That would be a
repository
great
of,
thing
right?
for the big church to take on, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I think in the past, there were a number of resources. Like when I arrived at Grace, we had the entire green hymnal in Braille. Unfortunately, we haven't used the green hymnal for 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not the most helpful resource for us to have if someone needs Braille for the worship service. But I think I just probably need to educate myself too about like what resources are out there and
Mm-hmm.
um, try to
Yeah.
collect them, right?
Right. Well, and also, I mean, not every blind person is a Braille reader. They're relying on technology and they need screen reader access. So sending everything in PDF or having only visual content on your screen with no description of what it says or what the image says isn't the best practice either for someone who might be blind or low vision. So again, it kind of goes back to trying to think through all of the different kinds of things. So just having Braille might work for a few people, but not everyone in that circumstance. And thinking through, as much as you can around the different ways that you can creatively have your service and have a faithful, spiritual, worshipful experience for as many people.
Yeah. So this relates to one of the questions that has been lifted up. And I'm going to change it slightly, and you can decide if you want to participate in this exercise or not. Would you be willing to have to talk about a couple of different types of disability and ways that congregations could support folk in that group generally during a time of COVID and then after COVID, is like now that we're apart and then when we're together? Would you be
Mm-hmm.
interested in playing that game with me slightly?
I can try.
Yeah, okay. Let's start with people who have visual impairments, because I think you were just speaking about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What are some ideas you have about how congregations can support folk with vision impairments during a time of COVID?
Okay, so one of the things that we are learning and hear, especially from the blind and low vision community, is the blind and low vision community in particular is feeling extremely closed in, shut in, isolated, and fearful. Not everybody, though there's always a danger when I talk about what we hear from a community perspective, but with my community engagement hat on, I will say that we have heard and we do know that the blind and low vision community are having particular difficulty, especially during COVID, because of, first of all, not knowing who's wearing a mask and who's not wearing a mask when they're outside, right? Not knowing what the physical space is going to look like now or feel like now, because we have different things in our sidewalks than we used to. The blind and low vision community in particular also has and does historically navigate by touching everything, and now suddenly we've been told don't touch anything. And so what we hear and are learning is that the blind and low vision community in particular are just deciding to just not go out at all. Which, I mean, I think a lot of people with disabilities are just choosing to shelter more than others. But that's the context. So in that context, what that means for me in terms of how we can respond is just first to be aware of that it might, some additional outreach might be good, because that is a very common experience. But then also, as we're thinking through the way that we're holding our virtual services, faith services, worship services, is to then think about, if you have content that is primarily visual that you're working through, that you're intentionally describing what is on the screen at the moment, so that you're not relying on everybody to just read something that they might not be able to read without assistive technology. And especially on a video, even if you do have assistive technology, if you put an image on a video, that technology that the blind or low vision person uses isn't functional in that environment. So it's about being intentional about, instead of saying, take a moment to read what's on the screen, just read what's on the screen. That helps people who are blind or low vision, that helps people with learning disabilities, that helps people who are English as a second language, that helps a lot of people. So it's a simple thing, but it's also, something that it's a simple thing that could be helpful. So I guess reach out and, present your material in multiple ways. Use your words instead of just your eyes, right? Is one way.
And that a lot of that applies to what happens when we go back to a world where COVID is less emergent.
Right.
Are there some things that churches should think about when we go back to physical spaces? What I heard and hadn't thought of before is that if we have rearranged, we need to orient people so that there can be safety, like verbally orient people so there can be safety.
Right. There's a phrase called mobility orientation. Mm-hmm. And what that means is, if you've changed your space around, it's a good idea to describe exactly what those changes are, so that people can be prepared for that.
All right. How about folk who have wheels?
Okay. So, ask me the question again.
Yeah. How can congregations support them during a time of COVID?
So I think, it's, in terms of what we hear from folks with mobility disabilities, it's some of the same things that we hear from the blind and low vision community. But I think unique to people with physical disabilities, one is that more people with physical disabilities tend to have other underlying health conditions which make them particularly at risk for contraction of COVID. And so that is something to be aware of in terms of people with physical disabilities are also feeling isolated. So they may need additional and different kinds of care support than they've needed in the past, or, just kind of basic assistance. For instance, I was talking with a friend of mine who is also a wheelchair user, who was talking about going to the grocery store. And she was like, in the past, I'd just be like, hey, can you help me reach the peanut butter or whatever, right? And now we're in such a space where nobody wants to touch anything, so it's harder to ask for help. So I think being just aware of intentionally asking people who have wheels if they need anything, first of all, And if they say no, or I'm good, or, leave me be, to not take that personally. It's just, they're good. But most people, I think, are grateful, and they will say right now, gosh, it would be good if we could figure out this, right? Or I need help with this, or whatever. So again, intentional outreach. And then I think, I guess the challenge that I would present when we're back in physical spaces for the most part again is thinking about your space and your practices in worship. And kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, is like, do you need to be doing them that way? Is there some real reason that you need to say, please stand at certain points? Or, because I mean, not only can that be challenging for people to feel included, it's also a very practical matter. Most of the time when everybody else is standing up, you literally can't see anything anyway. So it doesn't, so that I would then challenge people to just really think about, what is my space? What does it mean if I have an altar area? What does it mean to go up to the altar? Personally for myself, I like the opportunity to be able to do that when I'm feeling, in that mood. Sometimes I like ritual, sometimes I don't. But so, it just kind of, it depends on the day. So just thinking about what can we do to be, I guess, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say, don't do things just because it's the way you've always done them. Think through why you're doing them, and is that still important to you and to your congregation right now?
Yeah, I heard you say that people's minds might change on different days based on where they are too. And
Mm-hmm.
so having a more open idea rather than this is the way a person likes it might be
Mm-hmm.
helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know a congregation that stopped asking people to stand up and sit down. Some people still did it because they just were used to it.
Mm-hmm.
But they changed the language to lift up your heart,
Mm-hmm.
because that also was in scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, I think there's a number of ways that people can just adjust some things.
Mm-hmm. And then I will say too, one of the things, and this is very unintentional, is like, when one of the things that I think is, especially congregations who are new to providing access, if they haven't had access before, is they'll, so someone like, so I can roll into a space or whatever, and there's like a wheelchair spot. Most of the time that is where I will sit, but sometimes it just doesn't work out, or I don't know, I need to duck out, or I don't know. So 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 but what can happen is, oh, we have a space for you right here. And I completely understand the intention of that. Um, another way to think about that is, we're thinking about the way that we greet people is, um, there's um, we have wheelchair seating over here if you would like. So it's about the device and not the person. And then that tends to help a little bit, take some of that visibility and that pressure off of the person to sit in their relegated spot, as it were. Um,
I also have particularly appreciated times when you've been offered the wheelchair spot and then you respond with, "Thank you, but I'll be sitting on the chancel," because you're a part of the leadership of the service, and that makes me
right.
really happy every time you do it.
That's right. Yep. That's right.
Yeah. Do you have ideas about things that could be helpful during this time of COVID for folk who have auditory
Definitely.
disabilities?
So definitely. So with folks who are deaf or are hard of hearing, one thing that we're learning is that people who are deaf or hard of hearing in particular, a lot of people do read lips to some degree, but not everybody does. And so one thing that has been asked for, that we're trying to respond to, as a city, and we're not as far as we need to be yet, but we're trying to be intentional about having clear masks available so that we can communicate with folks who might need that kind of access, because it's very challenging to communicate what you need or want when the majority of someone's face is covered up. So think about it. I know most people have experienced this, but think about how much in the last 4 months we've needed to do double takes when we've seen people to say, oh wait, oh that is so and so, right? And so take that and then magnify it, because many folks who are deaf or hard of hearing are using facial cues to help to communicate. So this idea of having ways to communicate, I think, is very important. And then I think about,
I was just going to note, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to note that I would think that would be really important with first responders, because in an emergency, you want to be able to communicate.
Right.
And for some people, that's already a scary experience.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And we have now, luckily in San Francisco anyway, we have text to 911 finally, so that people who are deaf or hard of hearing have a way to access 911 and identify themselves as a deaf or hard of hearing person. So that does help in an emergency response kind of situation. But then, I mean, I think beyond thinking about how we're communicating, I would also think through, as we kind of go back into the into our recovery time and kind of into whatever the next status quo is going to be, around what devices and what kind of access do we need that we either haven't budgeted for or haven't consistently thought through, whether that be assistive listening device systems or a mechanism for live captions for someone, or an ASL interpreter if that is that person's preferred language. I think most people, it's a surprise for hearing people to learn that deaf people typically will acculturate around language first, not around disability. Many deaf people do not consider themselves disabled. They have a different language, and their language is American Sign Language. And so it's about thinking through those kind of language issues and what kind of access can we plan to have to be as inclusive as possible.
I learned when we had our listening session on ableism and autism that Zoom actually has an auto transcription ability. It just doesn't make it available. It's only available for certain groups and organizations. And so it was something that I wished that we could lobby for as faith communities, is like, we really need this ability. Can you please make it available to faith organizations? Because that would be so helpful to have auto transcription.
Yeah, I think that the auto transcription does help. And I think that the Zoom and some of the other companies are working towards that, and some are a little bit farther along. I think also members of the deaf community would say, I would rather have a live a captioner anyway. And there is a way for everyone to insert a live captioner remotely into what you're doing. So that's another way to do it. Because the auto captions are great, especially if you're budget limited, but they don't do any auto correction or anything like that in the way that a live person would. So, thinking through that, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful to think through before it is rolled out, if it gets rolled out to everybody else. We've had a question from Facebook for you to talk about autism, how congregations can care for folk on the autistic spectrum during this time of COVID.
I think, again, I'm going to just speak to what we've heard from folks and from parents and families around what the experience of folks with autistic disabilities or intellectual disabilities are experiencing. And the first thing that I would recognize is that there's been in that community generally, especially for some folks who, as part of the way they experience autism, are especially physically sensitive to stimulus, that this idea of needing to be protective and needing to have a face covering on all the time when you're around members that are not in your family is very scary, and in some cases uncomfortable. And so again, there's awareness around that, I think. And then I would say to, and in this area in particular, I think there locally, at least in the Bay Area, we've got a very strong community that has a lot of resources. So for instance, in San Francisco, there's the Arc of San Francisco. Use their professional advice as well in terms of what can we do to start thinking about making our spaces more inclusive. But I think that creating spaces and opportunities that have an opportunity for expression, but also for an acknowledgement of, you know, we're in a really scary time for a lot of people, and people with intellectual disabilities, developmental delays, and some severe autism spectrum are feeling very confused and scared. And we need to acknowledge that and help to do what we can to minimize that to the degree that we have control over it through the way that we're outreaching to members of our community.
Yeah, as someone on the autistic spectrum, I just wanted to lift up that I am really appreciative that people are now more aware of when they were physically touching people.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, touch is different. I prepare for it in communal spaces. I'm typically fine with it unless I've articulated I'm not, so you don't have to worry about if you've offended me in the past. But because people are much more aware of physical touch and are doing it less, I feel like I've had this break from a thing that has felt sort of oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things I think people can think about in the way that you mentioned, people can think about whether or not the physical parts of their worship service are necessary, is to think about ways that they can maintain consent over physical touch in worship services.
That's a good one.
Instead of celebrating, yay, we get to hug each other now, perhaps congregations could say those for whom touch is a part of their celebration, it's a thing that you can do, but here's how we're going to find out if other people are comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if differing ideas about how safe people are going to feel as we reopen
Mm-hmm.
will help us with those nuanced conversations. Like, I'm not yet ready for handshakes,
Mm-hmm.
right? If we're stepping back into the world kind of slowly, maybe those consensual conversations will happen more often. And so I just wanted to lift that up in case people for whom touch feels supportive and loving and faithful, absolutely celebrate when that comes back. I'll be excited that it's safer to do those things, but also know that there's a community that was like, oh, I'm so glad that we're not doing that all the time
Mm-hmm.
anymore. And
I think certain people with physical disabilities would feel the same way. You know, I think it's a nice gesture. It can also be pretty physically difficult for some people to, you know, hug or shake hands or even hold hands consistently during a community prayer circle. It's a physical effort, and so, you know, just being aware of that, I think, is good.
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about some of the ways that folk who had disabilities around immune system sensitivities, if there are ways that congregations can support them. My hunch is during this time of the coronavirus, we're going to be the most aware of trying to think about this population.
Yeah, I think this one for me, at least what comes to mind immediately is being aware of who is in your congregation, but also thinking about how are we reaching people who we haven't reached yet, who are feeling particularly, again, shut in, closed in, because they've had to do so out of self-protection. And I think one of the things that comes to my mind most immediately with folks who have chronic health conditions and disabilities is that although we're kind of getting more back to pre-COVID times in terms of the way that we're interacting when we do need additional support from a healthcare provider, that would it for for many months it was no non-emergency medical services were being provided, right? And so specifically for folks dealing with chronic health disabilities, they just stopped going to the doctor, and still in many cases are doing virtual appointments. So are folks really getting the health care that they need right now? Or people are dealing with chronic pain, how are they managing that? Or, so I think being aware, and I think offering and having networks to try to help support people getting through some of these really rough times. I mean, I know I'm very lucky that I've had a friend network in this time that's been really extraordinarily loving and kind and supportive and very last minute in many cases when I've needed some help with something. And I think we're in a period now where if you're healthy and willing to volunteer and help, do that. Or, if you're thinking about what can we do as a congregation to be more responsive, whether or not someone's in our community or not, I guarantee you there are people with disabilities who need volunteers to do something. I guarantee it. And there are volunteer organizations across the country that are trying to bring people together to do things, whether it's food distribution or running errands or whatever it is, and help in that way. I think right now is good. And again, not everybody is going to want it or need it, and that's okay. But I think just being aware that the world is just so different outside, and people are confined in many places now to very small spaces. Your world has become your apartment or your house, and so help make the world bigger again by being there and being present is my best advice.
Be present, but then my hunch is as if people are going to volunteer with communities who have vulnerable immune systems or who have maybe some of the most intersections in the risk factors that they have, that we would want to volunteer in ways that, every single one of those symptoms we take seriously on the COVID list, right? Yeah. So if we are people who have said this out loud, it's not COVID, it's just allergies, that we don't say that unless we have been tested.
Right.
That's
a very good point.
When we're choosing to volunteer with high-risk communities, right? Say it to whomever thinks that's a cute phrase, but don't say that when you're in a space of someone who's, recovering from cancer or who is immunosuppressed in some sort of way. But to really be honest when someone asks you what your exposure level is so they can make their own choices.
Right.
And maybe not engage in high-risk behaviors.
Right.
If you know you have this person you're visiting.
Yeah. There's a lot of really good guidance that's out there too about how to safely interact and interface with folks. I mean, we have had some practice in doing that in the last months, right? And so there's guidance out there. Follow it absolutely. If you have any symptoms at all, whether even if it's just, if it is allergy sniffles, the person who you're helping isn't going to understand that, and frankly, they're not going to care either. Because it's gonna feel scary. And so, I think that's a great point. To use the resources that are out there and be sensitive to how the best way that you can be helpful.
Yeah. If you know that you never want to be tested for the coronavirus with the swab, I've done it 4 times, I can tell you. On the left nostril, it hurts a lot. On the right, it doesn't. So whenever I go, I say use the right nostril, then I'm fine. Right. But if you know you never want to be tested, then maybe volunteering for someone with a disability might not be your thing. If you are like, test me every day as long as I keep this person safe, that might be more of the mindset for an immune compromised person. That's my gut reaction to it. But all right, and I'm going to ask you a question I didn't give you in advance.
Okay.
But is one that I heard from our previous listening session. Prayer. When people pray, there is a tradition in some communities and cultures to pray for people's specific body parts when they're having a medical procedure done. A month or so ago, one of my children prayed that disabilities didn't exist anymore, out of this loving idea that all people would be as safe and able as possible. I actually stopped the time of prayer to explain why that's not a prayer that we pray and how we rephrase that prayer. But do you have thoughts about how people can use some words in prayers that are going to be less triggering, especially because there's a lot of people on the disability spectrum who have had non-consensual prayers to heal them?
Yes.
And that has created a lot of trauma.
It happens all the time. It happens. Yes. It's people, I think, have, especially, I think, first of all, I just want to clarify that I think it depends how you identify and how you are visible in the world, right? And so I think generally people who, especially people who have physical and some sensory disabilities, especially encounter this idea of healing and cure more than someone who might have a hidden disability. But I think my advice is to think about, why are you asking for that? Is it really about that person's heart or that person's condition? Or is it about how you feel about how that person is coping and getting through their experience? So I would recommend maybe to take out that part and think about, as you're being meditative, how you're being responsive to the person instead of the condition, maybe, is one way. I think, it's complicated because there have been many times especially during COVID, where, and as recently as 2 days ago, where I have said to myself, being disabled right now really just sucks. It's horrible, and would it be easier if I didn't have a disability? Yes, probably. In some ways right now, yes. Then I take a step back and say, okay, but first of all, that's not my experience, so I can't wish it away, right? There is nothing that is going to change the fact that I have a disability. I always will, I always have, I always will. There are health conditions that can occur for us temporarily that can then be treated and go away and things are better, but that person still has always had that experience. The person who is the breast cancer survivor will always be a breast cancer survivor and always has now all of that stuff around breast cancer, whether they are cured of it or not. And so, and it changes, I think, the way that folks identify. And so it's about thinking about, again, just in my mind, it's about going back to what are you really, in that meditative moment, what are you really asking for? What are you hoping for? And what would that person that I'm thinking about want me to be asking for with them? Like if I were that person, what do I think they would want? And being really intentional about that. So it's a way to reframe that prayer a little bit.
Yeah, I think as a trans person, my hope is that no one will pray about the private parts of other people. And I think in prayers for people with differing abilities that maybe that same policy, like not just private parts, but parts of your life that are private.
Mm-hmm.
And so not doing a public prayer about someone that you're not certain what is private and what is public about what's going on for them. I would also say too, from what I've heard and listening, prayers that make people even less mobile feel even more traumatic. So like if someone made it so you no longer have choice about whether or not you can roll away from the prayer.
Mm-hmm.
If you're stuck there while someone's praying on you and at you, it's a very different experience than having the ability to leave and praying with someone rather than, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I've heard some of those things as well
Mm-hmm.
in conversations about prayer.
It can be very spectacular in the worst sense of that word. When you become that center of healing
Mm-hmm.
and again it also, or healing thoughts, or I think there's a fine line too between like wanting to push or radiate, maybe is a better word, community energy
Yeah.
onto that person, or love, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And maybe use that transformation instead of the healing transformation.
Yeah.
That's a much broader way to think about health, through a
Yeah.
lens of love or energy. So and then that can mean whatever it needs to mean to that person, who's however they're feeling on that day, which might be a good day, might be a bad day.
In your private capacity, would you be willing to uh, help us with a prayer to end our time together?
Sure.
And by what I mean by that is I'll say some things, and if you want to say some things, you can. Um, and maybe we can model what some of that language can look like.
Okay, I will do my best.
Yeah, no
Okay.
pressure. You're fine. Even if you just are like, amen, it's fine. Right?
Okay.
So I'm going to propose that we pray to the God of Ezekiel, the God of Ezekiel who moved with wheels that could shoot flames at folk who got too close. Right? I pray that God, who understands what it's like to be in flesh and bone and what it means to have that flesh and bone altered and broken, would be with us in all the ways that we have flesh and bone that is beautiful in all of its configurations. I pray that everyone have a heart that is open to people of all disabilities, of people of all mobilities, of people of all variations and spectrums. And I pray that faith communities rearrange their architecture when it's a barrier.
I pray that we move forward from a place of awareness as a first step, that we take time to recognize our own biases, even if we've never thought about things like ableism before, that we start to think about that now, and that we think about compassion rather than healing or fixing or changing.
I pray that all who work in professional capacities that care for folk with disabilities feel blessed in their work, have all the fiscal and physical resources that they need, spend more time helping people and supporting people than they do justifying their positions, and know that the community of faith is rooting for them and excited that they are living out their calling.
I will say amen to that one.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. And I also lift up a blessing for all who during this time of COVID have experienced additional isolation.
Absolutely.
Those who are fearful of their health, those who feel like or experience fewer resources medically, and those who are in need of additional support but have not yet gotten it in a secure, ever-present way that lifts people up rather than draining their finances and their energy and anything else that's being drained. Yeah, go ahead.
I also pray that people use their energy and what they learn to help people who might not know what services exist, and that, so that everybody can be aware of the kinds of services and supports there are out there. Because although we're not meeting everything that we need to be meeting, there is a lot, and there's a lot happening, and there's a lot that people don't know about, and we can be those agents of change and information.
And I pray a prayer of thanksgiving for everyone who is trying, for those who are trying too hard, for those who are trying too little, for those who are trying just the right amount. Wherever folk are in their space of trying, I give thanks for them. I give thanks for all the congregations who have accomplished wonderful things. And I give thanks for all of the folk who pastor with disabilities, all the folk who read lessons with disabilities, all the folk who usher with disabilities, all the folk that sit in pews, and all of the folk who embody and show up in faithful spaces in whatever ways they show up in them.
I give thanks for everything that is yet to come that we don't know about yet.
Yeah.
We can change the way we think about worship, and it can be amazingly transformative. And so I give thanks for everyone who is willing to think about some of these tough questions and transform themselves or their congregations in a new way because of conversations like this one, and because of conversations that we need to keep having.
And may these prayers be ever present on God's mind and ever present in God's verbing actions in our world, and ever present in the stream of ever flowing justice that God's going to push our direction, whether we like it or not.
Amen.
Amen.
Great.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm so glad that you could join us today.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here and listening. I'm really happy to have had such a fruitful conversation. So thank you so much.
Lutherans.